Well, we're now ready to look at the story of Abraham, and this really is in Genesis chapter 12, verses 1 to 3. This marks a key moment within the story, and we are really looking at God's faith family. So the story of Abraham, not only do we find the promises given in Genesis 12, 1 to 3, and if you haven't underlined this in your Bible, you certainly want to do so. You'll find on the timeline that I have a bullet point summary of Abraham, and I've got God calls Abraham out of Ur. Abraham is elderly and his wife is barren. And then I've got a whole series of promises that God makes to Abraham. And these promises, you'll notice there's a cluster of them. We have some stars there. There's a picture of a cloud. There's a crown. These promises form the background for the entire storyline of the Old Testament. And so I would encourage you, Genesis 12, 1 to 3, Genesis 17, 1 to 8. Those are the key passages. And in the Bible study that you have some chapters that you're going to be reading, but you may even want to read the whole Genesis 12 all the way through to the end of the book, because that's going to give you the large sweep of the story. And anything you learn about Abraham and Isaac and Jacob is going to help you understand the Bible as a whole. So it really is worth your time. So I'm going to read from Genesis 12, 1 to 3. I'm reading from the New American Version. You may have NIV, you may have ESV. That's fine. I'm going to be reading from the New American. I'm going to read Genesis 12, 1 to 3, but then I want to set the context for Abraham in chapter 11, verse 27, the verses beforehand, because that's our first bullet point that says God calls Abraham out of Ur, and I want to unpack that just for a couple of moments. So Genesis 12, 1 to 3. Now the Lord said to Abraham, "Go forth from your country and from your relatives and from your father's house to the land which I will show you. And I'll make you a great nation, and I will bless you, and I will make your name great, and so you shall be a blessing. And I will bless those who bless you, and the one who curses you I will curse." And then notice what it says at the end. "And in you all the families of the earth will be blessed." And we're going to pick up that last section there and highlight why it's so important. But first of all, I want you to notice the context for the call of Abraham, because the call of Abraham doesn't begin in the promised land. It begins in a place called Ur in Mesopotamia. And at this point, I would encourage you to have your map open, and this is the first map, Abraham's journey to the promised land. And you will notice on the map that he begins in a place called Ur in Mesopotamia, and he's going to travel north to Haran, and then he's going to travel south toward the promised land and finally arrive in a place called Shechem. So you want to see the length of this journey. God is calling him to leave his family, leave all his hometown, and embark on this new faith journey. And that's in fact really reminds us of our own journey with God, that there is a wonderful call that God places on our lives to bring us to himself on a new faith journey. And so the place of Ur is important as we look at Abraham, because this was a place where many gods were worshipped. And in fact, there is a ziggurat, what we call a ziggurat, which is a temple in the ancient world, like a step temple. And this ziggurat was dedicated to the moon god Sin. And so I want to remind us, as we think about the call of Abraham, that he's growing up in an idol-worshipping family, Joshua 24, verse 2. And he doesn't yet know who the Lord is. And in fact, he believes in many gods, because that's what everyone believed in the ancient world. And so in Genesis chapter 11, verses 27 to 32, it sets the context for the call of Abraham. And that raises the question, well, how does Abraham ever find out about who God is? And so Acts chapter 7, verse 2 says that the God of all glory showed up in Ur and made promises. And this reminds us that this is an act of God's initiative. God initiates in our lives. This is an act of his grace. And he is the one who is revealing himself to Abraham, and he's going to make promises to him. So this is going to be very important, setting the context, reminding us and the grace of God. I also want you to notice in the opening verses in Genesis 11, verse 30, that it says, Sarah was barren, she had no child. And this also is going to help us to start to see what God is doing, because it's so interesting that one of the key promises God makes to Abraham is you are going to have so many children you can't even count them. And yet we find that Sarah is barren. They're not only barren, but they're an elderly couple. And so the question is, what is God doing? And this is going to highlight for us the importance of them having to trust in God, and God is going to bring life out of that which is dead. It's only going to happen through his work in their life. That's the only way they're going to have children. And this reminds us at the outset of the redemptive plan of God, that this is his initiative and he's the one who's bringing it to pass. So now if you look at Genesis chapter 12, 1-3, what you'll find is God makes promises. He's going to tell him to go to a new land, and the land is going to be the land of Canaan, or what we also call the promised land, or the land of Israel. So all those terms refer to the same land, and God's promising to make his name great. And then he's going to promise him later in Genesis chapter 17, verses 1-8, he's going to promise that he's going to become a multitude of nations. And he's promising that kings will come forth from him. And so in Genesis 17, that's where God also changes his name from Abram to Abraham, reminding us of the promise of a multitude of nations. And also look at the last sentence in verse 3. It says, "And in you all the families of the earth will be blessed." Well, this promise is repeated several times in Genesis. And what it really underscores is that the call of Abraham and God's blessing upon him was not so that he would simply have a nice, fun, happy life or something. It was so that he would be a blessing to the nations. And in fact, through him and through his descendants, or literally through his seed, all the nations of the earth will be blessed. And this again is one of those key moments within the redemptive story. You'll see in the study guide that each one of these promises are summarized, and I explain every one of them that are on the timeline, and I show you how they're being fulfilled in the New Testament with Jesus. And this is one of the fabulous promises, because the promise is given to Abraham and to his seed, literally seed, that's the language, and that term is a singular in Hebrew, and Paul is going to pick that up in Galatians chapter 3 and say Jesus is the seed to whom the promise had been given. So that's just wonderful. Genesis chapter 15, next section I'd like you to look at. If you have your Bible open, again, I want to highlight one verse in particular. Genesis 15 verse 6. Again, I have a whole section on this in the study guide. And so Genesis 15:6, it's another moment where we pause. It's also on the timeline. And on the timeline, I said, Abraham believes that God will perform what he has promised. And so here we have Abraham hasn't had any children yet. And so he's saying, God, how do I know that you're going to give me the land? And God takes him outside in a vision. He says, look at the stars and see if you can count them. And it says, Abraham believed in the Lord, and he reckoned, that is God, counted it to him as righteousness. So what this really means is that even though Abraham is ungodly at this time, that God is counting his faith as though it was an act of righteousness. And so this is why we saw the gift for this time period, both Genesis 12, when God turns up in Ur, that's his grace. Here again, we see the grace of God, because Romans chapter 4, Paul's going to quote this same verse. It's another great chapter. I would read through the whole chapter, because it's going to remind you that this verse, Genesis 15:6, Paul says it wasn't just said for his sake only, but for our sake also. And so Paul is going to show the significance of the entire redemptive story of the Bible. And it reminds us this is Abraham's, this is going to be the faith family, God's faith family he's building, and it's going to be through faith. And Abraham believes that God can bring life out of that which is dead, because he looks at the deadness of his own body and the deadness of Sarah's womb. That's what Paul says in Romans chapter 5. And so we join in this faith journey as we believe in God who raised Jesus from the dead. So it's another wonderful story. Also in the same chapter, Genesis chapter 15, God is going to make a covenant with Abraham, and this starts in Genesis 15 verse 7. And he says, I am the Lord who brought you out of Ur. And this now introduces one of the key covenants. As we go through the story of the Old Testament, I'm going to highlight major covenants along the way, especially the covenant here with Abraham. We're going to see the covenant with the Israelites, the Mosaic covenant, and then the Davidic covenant. So this is one of those moments, and basically it is an ancient ceremony, and God tells Abraham to get some animals, to cut them, and then we find this torch, fiery torch, passes between the pieces, and we read that on that day the Lord cut a covenant, literally cut a covenant, because that's what you do in the ancient world, that the Lord cut a covenant, and he is making his promises to Abraham. He is affirming them by covenant. And I want you to notice also that Abraham is not promising anything. This is only God. And we love covenants that God promises, because we are going to see in the story of the Old Testament that God's people don't do a good job keeping their promises. And so this is one of these promises that is going to be referred to throughout the story of the Old Testament. Moses is going to do it when we come to the golden calf story. He's going to say, remember your promise you made with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And so read this wonderful story. It is an ancient ritual, but it is God committing himself by covenant to make promises. And then you're also going to be reading Genesis chapter 17. This is the covenant of circumcision. This is given as a sign. But I do want you to notice in this passage as well that God is making the covenant is going to be reaffirmed with the child who's going to be born to Abraham and Sarah. Then we have Genesis chapter 18. You have the promise of the birth of Isaac. I love that chapter, because here there is no chance Sarah, humanly speaking, can have a child. And yet these angelic visitors promise that at this time next year, you're going to have a child. And so we have the birth of Isaac in Genesis chapter 21. Again, another key high point within the story, reminding us that the children of Abraham are not those that are born biologically, but they are going to be born by the Spirit according to promise. And again, this is one of those chapters I spent some time looking at it within the study guide to help you see. We also have biological children within the book, of course, Ishmael, and then we're going to trace the line of Abraham's descendants. But God is doing something here. Isaac is born supernaturally by promise, and Paul then is going to pick up that language in Galatians chapter 3 and 4 and Romans chapter 9, and so the children of Abraham are those born according to promise. And so there are hints of this already in this story. And then we come to Genesis chapter 22, and what you find here is that God is going to test Abraham's faith. He loves his children, Ishmael in chapter 21, and now Isaac in chapter 22. God had already asked him to send out Ishmael, because the heir of the promise would only be Isaac at this point in the story. And now in Genesis 22, God is testing Abraham to see, is he willing to put God first before his own son and before his beloved son. And so he's going to go up to this place in the region of Moriah, and this is actually going to be the place many years later when King David is going to buy the threshing floor, 1 Chronicles chapter 21, and this is going to be the place where the temple is built under King Solomon. And so God at the last moment steps in. There's going to be a burnt offering, but it's not Isaac. It is going to be an animal in place of it. And so this underscores, and James picks this up, the importance of Abraham's ongoing faith that is working itself out in works of faith. And so Genesis chapter 22 also reminds us that this is going to be the place where burnt offerings are going to be provided for. And then it is even going to anticipate even further the fact that one day God is going to offer up his beloved Son. And so that gives us hints of something even greater that is to come. So Abraham, great story. We will be continuing the story of his family in the next series, the next video, but encourage you to underline some of the promises in your Bible and to review this section on the timeline and the map so that you can keep the story in front of you as we go forward.